In October 2015, New York City math tutor Mike Manzi arrived at the house of a girl he'd been talking to for a while. They chatted here and there and had pretty similar interests, and for all intents and purposes, they seemed to have quite the spark between the two of them. But there were two things majorly wrong with this meetup. First, Manzi was 32, while the girl he was talking to was 13. And two, this was also a sting. It wasn't long after he entered the house that he would be set upon by none other than the predator hunting legend, Chris Hansen, who had some pretty tough questions for the guy. Once the barrage of questions were finished, Hansen revealed the nature of the show and what Manzi had just walked himself into. He was now among the first guests to appear on his newly branded series, Hansen vs. Predators. He was free to leave, but Manzi, who was familiar with Hansen and his programs, knew that he would be arrested the moment he walked out. He begged and pleaded with head of security Ron Knight to be released, but he wouldn't budge. Manzi eventually did leave, where he was nearly tased by the officers, only to be arrested and spilled his guts out to the detective. He pleaded guilty to child endangerment and was given a suspended sentence. Manzi was unique among the roster of other predators, mostly because of his hilarious reactions, and because he was the only one who didn't want to have sexual relations with the decoy he was talking to. There's even debate on whether or not he should have been invited to the stink house. Jump forward to 2019, where Chris Hansen was looking to rejuvenate his career as a journalist. He was free of any networks and decided to go full-on independent. And to help build interest in his new projects, he started a short-lived failure of a website, where he released the full uncut versions of the Hansen vs. Predator interviews. Well, at least the ones who actually showed up anyway. But among the ones actually released, there was one predator who was noticeably absent from the lineup. Mike Manzi. For some never-explained reason, Mike Manzi's uncut footage was never released to the public, despite the fact that it would have made a hilarious companion piece to the footage we already have of the guy. But why was it never taken off the shelf? Well, apparently we have an answer. It would seem that Manzi actually has ties to someone involved in the sting. Familial ties. According to an unknown source, Mike Manzi's uncle is none other than Ron Knight, Chris's longtime head of security and professional door blocker. This news sparked some debate in the community, mostly tied to the likelihood of Manzi and Knight actually being related, and whether or not that played any role in Manzi's footage being kept off the air. So I figured I'd look into this myself and try to discern what really happened and why it's possible that the story is true. I personally believe that, well, it's not. The story circles around a text conversation between two unknown parties with no names or credits found anywhere. That already brings its authenticity into question. The story goes that Ron Knight was not exactly excited about the show luring his possible nephew, and that he would only allow him to be shown if specific edits were made. Hence why there seems to be missing scenes from the final cut. Manzi apparently threw a huge fit where he blamed Knight for his situation, and how he didn't do anything to stop him from showing up. The messages also claim that Knight did offer legal help to Manzi, but that he refused to accept any of it and apparently hates him for having a helping hand in ruining his life. Now that we have that out of the way, let's look at why the story might be possible, to say the least. A lot of the story hinges on the simple fact that Manzi's footage was never released. And to the credit of the person who supplied this information, there does seem to be some footage missing from the confrontation between Hansen and Manzi. Chris doesn't give his big, "I'm Chris Hansen, and this is," moment. What's funny is that in the segments that were split off, you can actually see a brief glimpse of this moment where Manzi tries to block himself from the cameras and nothing more. There's obviously some footage missing from the final cut. As far as missing footage goes, there's definitely some questions here. The messages also claim that Knight helped get Manzi out on bail, and with his contacts could have gotten him community service. But Manzi shunned him and ended up with a felony conviction instead. It's common knowledge that knowing the right people can help you out if you're in a tight spot. And to be fair, Manzi didn't seem like the most mature or level-headed person, so it's possible that he may have rejected Knight's help, regardless of how beneficial it was to him. Now that we've gone over why this whole situation is probable, it's time to discuss why I believe that, well, it isn't. Let's look at Ron Knight for a minute. Despite being involved with the series from the start, Ron Knight isn't exactly someone who looms large in the series. He's mostly seen in the background in several episodes, usually standing next to Chris when he's on his way to confront a predator. His two most notable moments of screen time was when he nearly judo chopped Rabbi David K, and when he talked to his alleged nephew and tried to convince him to surrender. Outside of an interview he gave with Chris during his 2019 resurgence, there's not much known about the guy. While I can believe he would be upset as any of us would if a loved one showed up to a predator sting, I don't imagine him granting anonymity to anyone, let alone his own family. That would be a slap in the face to his profession and a completely hypocritical move on his part. It's important to know that while the official reason for Manzi's unreleased footage remains up for debate, there has never been an official word from Chris or anyone else he was involved with at the time. Since then, both Manzi and Hansen have discussed the sting separately, Hansen on his podcast, and Manzi in a lengthy interview with Joey TCAP. Hansen maintains that Manzi was there for more nefarious reasons than he let on, while Manzi goes into what life has been like for him since appearing on the show. The one thing neither of them seem to mention is Manzi having any relation to Ron Knight, or any of the information mentioned in the text messages. While Manzi might not want to bear all, it would seem almost out of character for Chris to want to keep something like this under wraps. If there's one thing that Chris has proven over his years as a journalist, it's that he's clearly not above exploiting any kind of story, public or private, as long as it draws an attention. And something like this would be too tempting not to release. And while yes, Chris did keep the Ambrosio footage locked away, he did eventually release it. And that was a person that Chris actually seemed to feel sorry for. And from the looks of it, he didn't seem to give a damn about what happened to Manzi. For me, it all comes down to the authenticity of that text conversation. It's entirely possible that this is true and there was some scandalous cover-up to protect Ron Knight's reputation, but there's still one question that remains. Why was Mike Manzi's footage never released? Well, at the time that Chris was releasing the uncut interviews from the sting, he was also releasing a number of copyright takedowns. This was the short-lived war between Hansen and the TCAP content creators. You see, Chris felt that because he was the face of the show, that somehow he owned the copyright to any video featuring him or pretty much any video having anything to do with TCAP. This went on for a while before Chris eventually fired the man who convinced him to take all these videos down, and all was right with the world. Eventually. It's possible that during all this commotion, they just never got around to finalizing Manzi's footage as they did with the others. And since then, Chris has moved away from his TCAP style videos and has moved on to interviewing suspected perverts after the police already have them in handcuffs. Until we have that uncut footage, we know as much as Hansen is willing to tell us. And for now, that's where I'm going to leave this story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.